the Restart Pod. Today we have like a fairly interesting discussion that I'll let Damon kind of tee up. We ponder a lot of things in our chat, and I think this category of pondering is fairly controversial. So hit it, Damon. Go for it.
Yeah, this is not necessarily a thought that I believe, but it's one that I couldn't quite get out of my head as I've been kind of digesting the you know AI news over the last week or so, and specifically, there's been some reports that Tesla, as an example, is beginning to cap their AI usage at like $200 per user per week, which seems like a reasonable number to me. We can maybe circle back to that, but I just had a stray thought that again I just can't let go of, and I wanted to share this for discussion because I think it's fun. I don't think this is necessarily serious, but may have some serious implications. Um, we saw token maxing kind of be this flash in the pan moment of Amazon, Meta, reports of other companies as well, kind of throwing up internal leaderboards saying like whoever can use the most tokens wins, right?
Yeah.
I think on its surface, that seems intuitively kind of silly to be just ranking folks on how many tokens they're using without any sort of consciousness to what those tokens are being used for. Are they driving real
Right.
business value? Are they researching given directions? Or are they just kind of spamming API calls with no apparent end in sight? The question I would ask, I think, to anyone thinking about this is what if token maxings were just a clever shroud for distillation of these models? Imagine for a moment that I'm Meta. My attempts at open sourcing have failed. My attempts to
Hmm.
privatize the building of my AI models to date have not led to the type of state of the art capabilities that my competitors, the Anthropics and the OpenAIs of the world, have been able to achieve. And I want to shortcut my route to building the next state of the art model that I'm going to release. How might I do
Right.
that? Maybe I would use distillation. I can't do that, however, because that's against terms of service. That's against the arrangements from all of the major labs. But if I instead set up an internal leaderboard that just spammed API calls per se, such that it overwhelmed Claude and the internal Claude team's ability to review what those API calls were doing, is that perhaps a backdoor to distillation? So I'll end with that question
Mm.
mark and see what you think of that.
Well, kind of two things. So I think that there's like you assume people are either very smart and sophisticated, or you assume they're generally dumb. um, and my unfortunate cynicism is that like if you look at the general enterprise, I think like it's generally composed of like not very. We're not watching Game of Thrones for the most part when you're looking at like the F500, right? Um, and so like the token maxing like pill, whatever you want to call it, like whatever color of pill you want to label that as, like in some parts is literally just like internal politics of a business. Like you have to look good, and there's no way to say like I'm an AI forward leader. I should be promoted to VP. Aside from like my third of the engineering org outperforms your third of the engineering org, and thus we're better at using AI. Like I know, like while working at Nike, like there's like we got to figure out like an AI strategy. Like we need to have our team figuring out how we use AI in this company. And like in that case, it's very pro Anthropic and pro any one of these like license providers, even Cursor in this case, to just like accept that they get to read our traces generally. And the token maxing narrative is very pro Anthropic, pro Cursor, pro Frontier Lab in that case. In the other case, so like there are some parts of the world where it is Game of Thrones. Meta, I would not be surprised if Mark Zuckerberg is like a very clever player. And if they were just like allowed to just like collect traces and like distill models away, there's definitely value to that. I do think like even outside of the tinfoil hat, like I think most teams should be trying to collect traces. Like I don't know what's legal versus not. I think most if you are deploying AI to the org, like you should be trying to collect as many traces as humanly possible. Not even with the explicit intent of distillation, but just like what the hell is going on? Like and if you have all that data, all of a sudden like you're in a position to like then distill your model and then kind of run off. I don't think that's the norm yet. And I don't know how like folks would even begin to control for that if like you have to sell a harness or a model like servicing tool and you can't get the benefit of like I have capture of the API calls without someone wrapping that in something. Like I just don't know how you like physically avoid that. Um, and like corporate, like people say like obey the terms of service. People don't obey the terms of service. Like you obey, you don't obey until your hand gets slapped for some reason. Unless you're a gigantic enough org that's like provably a problem. Alibaba, for example, with what just happened with Anthropic, like that is completely unsurprising. Like why wouldn't they be doing that? And why wouldn't you extend that to like Facebook? And why
Mm,
wouldn't you extend that to like even Airbnb or whosoever? Like if you have like this hyper intelligence like wire, like why would you not look at that and be like, I should tap that thing?
mhm,
Like if you have like this Oracle machine that you don't own, but you get to like plug an Ethernet cable into it, human behavior would probably be like, I could just put a little thing on that thing. I could know so much,
mhm.
Why wouldn't you?
Yeah.
Like it's
Yeah.
kind of cynical. It's like a little bit like also giving people the benefit of the doubt of how clever they are. But I think even like a dumb or a smart person want to tap the wire, inevitably.
Yeah. I think to me the theory kind of falls a little bit flat on its face in the sense that again it's just overwhelmingly unlikely that that actually was the intent. I actually do think that a lot of these groups were it's twofold. I think like you said, internal politics of I want to look like I'm using AI well, therefore the only metric they've given me to track that's token use. I'll just default to that. Perfectly aligns
Hmm.
with like default human behavior. Probably no more or less than just that simple outcome. The second thing is for a while the public stock markets were rewarding this AI narrative. And so just by having the
Yep.
leaderboard being able to show you were spending a bunch on AI tokens was rewarding in the stock market. And that's no longer the case
Right.
because people's opinion of token maxing is kind of soured. So I'm sure there are much
Right.
more kind of straightforward and logical reasons for this token maxing besides kind of this shroud for distillation. That said, I think it's partially true in the sense that we know on pretty good authority because of the XAI or the Elon versus Altman case, let's call it, the kind of
Hmm.
Elon versus OpenAI case, that XAI was absolutely distilling on
Yep.
Anthropic and OpenAI models. We also have it on pretty good reports that Meta probably was as well in their
Yep.
open source efforts. So again, we can't know anything for certain, but we certainly do know that there are, companies that try to roll their own models that have, in some parts, insignificant or significant, we don't know, done some forms of distillation in the past. So again, I
Yeah.
think just thinking about it.
It's
Oh,
it's
good.
it's it's just like I went to this is a really random reference. In Washington D.C., there's this spy museum, and like in the spy museum, you can like just like look at all sorts of cases of like espionage, and some of them are of course like in the middle of the war, like how you like drop information to troops or whatever. But obviously, as things proceeded and like America and the rest of the world industrialized, like a lot of that espionage turned into corporate, where like there's all sorts of like elaborate techniques about like the one that stuck out in my memory is like the color of the Oreo was like very valuable IP. Something about the way that they get the cream that specific color is based off a very specific ingredient, and that was like protected IP that like the manufacturer of Oreo at the time wanted to make sure like no one got a drop of effectively. And you can read this whole billboard about like how like some guy got like an internal employee thing to try and like figure out the color and figure out what dye they were using to get the like color of the Oreo right. So they could then produce a clone that like off market felt like an Oreo but had all of its like same appeal without needing the brand name.
Mhm.
And you look at all that and that like the tendency for espionage has like always been there. You have something valuable, people will mock it. Even the simplest like TikTok shop thing that will go viral off like some kind of almost it's almost pitiable as a position of like you're like a arts and crafts maker, like you run like a small business and you make like something that's really cool and goes viral. It'll take all of like 2 weeks for Timu shops to like pop up with a clone that's really shitty, but people will buy anyway. Like that tendency has existed for all time in some shape or another. And right now, like the espionage of weights is one of the easiest things to do. Like the only reason like token maxing has soured in the economy is just because like token maxing has been barricaded behind an API for the most part culturally, right? Like you can't sell a mass of Claude seats at the $200 a month subscription plan and like expect very metal usage or like control of your destiny, that sort of thing. So the espionage game is kind of played really weakly, almost. Like it's really hard to be defensive in this modern day's primary topic of espionage.
Mhm.
It's kind of like it's unsurprising the way things are going. I would not be surprised if more like I don't know what people even call like the Magnificent Seven, like this category of like how people had like Fang back in the day. Like there's a new category of those companies that have a different name. I would not be surprised if like Nvidia seems like at least somewhat faithful company, but why wouldn't they have traces of a lot of what's running on their GPUs, right?
Yeah.
If they want to like blast an open source model thing, which is probably to their interest at some point or another, just not right now, like they would absolutely be in the position to eat the lawsuit if it actually ever comes out and then just move on with the corporate damage you've done that outweighs the damage of a lawsuit, hypothetically.
Yeah. Yes, taking the conversation in a slightly more serious tone, just because you kind of set the stage for it there. Currently, it's not in NVIDIA's best interest to roll their own model.
Mm-hmm.
I think in many ways because the you know value of providing the model is still, I think, up for
Yeah.
debate. Like, you know,
Return on value of service, like
yeah,
like the profit
yeah,
per token is not clear.
yeah, we know that inference is probably very good margins, but still training your own model is
Mm-hmm.
still ROI negative, right? Like you're still burning lots of
Right.
R&D dollars to train the model, and then how long the model lasts, how long until kind of open source or some other competitor catches up and can serve that model for cheaper. Like I think Nvidia is just looking at this saying, we own the hardware stack. Let's defend, part of the hardware stack as we see more and more competitors come to that space. If the world really pivots to open source, we can kind of become the AWS-like provider of that because we have
Right.
direct access to the metal in the data centers. Like we don't have to be there now; we can kind of be there whenever we want to. I think they're just taking
Right.
a very thoughtful wait and see approach, but I do think that's right in the sense that, like, you know, open source, closed source, we've debated, we'll continue to debate it to debate at length. To me, it feels less about open source and closed source and more about how much economic value is captured by demands of frontier slash state of the art models and how much can be routed to dumber models, for lack of a better word. To me,
Right.
it's smartest and dumber, not closed source and open source. But again, we can parse that
Yeah.
in many ways.
The way I look at it is that like with the problem right now is that tokens are culturally like demand is a function of culture right now for tokens, right? Demand is like for compute, demand is not a function of culture. It's a function of like LLM labs need this revenue margin. It's on them to figure out the culture part, but that compute's always necessary and bottlenecked, so they're secure in keeping that. I think when you move to the conversation about like, if you look at 2 years ago when like ChatGPT first blew up, right? Like most use cases, most cultural demand was perfectly lossy, right? There's no like fiscal justification at that moment if you don't extrapolate into the future as to like why we would invest in this technology further, aside from it being hypothetically cool. Obviously capital pushes things that like, hey, what if we scale continuously? And that creates the bitter lesson, that we have with software and everything now. But looking at like coding agents, right? Like that it's still the cultural whim of like, hey, should I be just like, and this kind of gets to your conversation that we might be reserving for later or not, but this idea of like, can I just swarm any given problem with as many tokens as possible is a cultural opinion that may not always be true, you know?
Yeah, yeah. I don't think we should go to the debate on is AI a bubble or is it not a bubble right now. But I think just to the point you're making, I think there are still several examples of that chat GPT like organic demand that exists across the
Mhm.
marketplace that very much justify the build out for all of these hyperscalers. And what I mean by
Right.
that is, like, if you just take 11 labs, no one's
Mhm.
subsidizing demand for 11 labs. They are
Right.
growing on an exponential rate because people are cloning voices and doing things with AI voice all over the place.
Right.
Um,
Right.
Midjourney, right, was profitable basically from day one. There was nobody subsidizing that demand, right? I mean, Whisper, as the other example, people want to talk to these things, and
Right.
they're not just defaulting to the open AIs plus voice. of the world. They're
Right.
paying for incrementally better performance on those things because it just matters, right? I think
Right.
maybe the strongest counterexample to any of that is if AI capability didn't matter, everyone would be using Siri.
Right. Well, for the record, I'm agreeing with you. The intent of my statement's more of one of like, if you look at Anthropic and OpenAI, like this idea of like demand as a function of culture, right? Like the demand that Mid-Journey 11 Labs is serving, right? Like the amount that like the weights and bias of culture in what they're doing is fairly fixed, right? Like if I'm going ahead and saying like I'm going to create a voice agent company, right? The demand for customer support use cases is like a fairly measurable like TAM. And if you just focus on that and you focus on like maybe some hobbyist projects, whatever, like the demand function's like fairly known. You continue to get better at that, you serve, you move along. Um like what I think is happening right now is like everyone knows coding agents are fantastic. The demand for coding agents is like only upwards trending, right? There's no reason to believe otherwise right now. But what is different compared to the voice agent sort of thing is that like, well, I'll make an example of 11 Labs, right? You have a business, you have customers. Those customers need to like be able to answer to or like have problem solved any sort of variety. The scale up and quality of vocal agents has like very predictable like my CSAT goes up, right? Right now, I think the conversation that you raised on like token maxing and like what happened with Brian Armstrong and like them showing how they reduced the token spend, the economy, the loss of the leaderboards in a corporate setting, is that I think people are able to find value in shapes that like token maxing was a cultural event. I think like vocal agent maxing is not really a thing, but is a
Mm.
comparable thing that if you look at and say like that makes sense. You know, like it makes a lot of sense that you'd throw as many vocalized agents as opposed to people at a problem that those two things can equivalently serve, right?
Mhm.
But on the other hand, like coding agents or like these cybersecurity might end up being a really, really high value use case that culturally might end up shifting the coding agent market over to that thing. And for what started this through this conversation, for NVIDIA's use case, that might end up saying that NVIDIA can just keep sitting and waiting to then say, like, oh, this is culturally robust, right? There's no reason for us to believe that demand on this thing would shift in a weird way. So we're gonna all of a sudden say capture value and then call it a day. You know, and like if we want to play up to the model layer, the labs have done all the hard work of finding what's culturally robust. Cheers, y'all. Here's your model that's open source and then gives everyone the AI sovereignty that ends up being competitive with the closed source like rollout, I suppose.
Yeah, we're saying the same thing. I think just adding some words to it, the
Yeah.
only thought that comes to my mind as you're speaking is culture has staying power. And so, like,
Yeah.
once the thing has been validated as culturally relevant down one vector or the other, the likelihood that it's more fad and not long term sustainable diminishes.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
and that's again, we're saying the same thing there.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like for example, the world of like voice agents is really really fascinating because right now it started with like customer support and that's where it's mostly being deployed, but we're now beginning to see like both you and I can code from our phones. Like what does that end up doing to like an interface change that is more vocal and people already dictate to like whisper flow and that sort of thing. That the culture of coding, which is where like the vast majority of these tokens is going, like may take a different shape that encourages like I don't know. It's possible that the coding agents might become like not text first, and what ends up happening there, I don't know. But that's a thing that like could shift. You know, it could be like they act in text, but they receive in something that's more narrow band. Never know.
Yeah, on that line of thinking, I don't know if you saw this or not, but there was a report floating around X. I want to say it originated with Ethan Mollick, but don't cite me on that
Okay.
specifically. There might be somebody that kind of introduced it first, but essentially they had traced through the internal dialogue for Fable, and it effectively
Okay.
was communicating with itself and subagents in a language that was not English. Basically, it kind of made up its own language to communicate in a way that was slightly more efficient, apparently, than English. So nothing
Interesting.
definitive as of now, but just as you're thinking about that, like I voice English certainly is not the most efficient
Right.
interface, even if it's the
So,
most
like,
well known
did
for
it
humans.
have a visual? Like, was it characters or
Yeah,
anything?
there were some screenshots and stuff that we can throw up in the show notes, and we
Okay.
can again we can
Yeah,
put a pin
do
in.
show me.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we can put.
Interesting.
I can see if I can find it here just while we're speaking about it. But yeah, I mean, I think the logical implication there is even in the event that English takes over because it's
Right.
the world is kind of English speaking. Most professional knowledge work happens in English
Right.
right now. There obviously is some version of an evolution that
Yeah.
could um, emerge, I
Yeah.
guess, from the very specific need, if you will, for AI to become more efficient. Like if it's kind of
Interesting.
constantly driving at reward functions, I don't think English is a destination. It's probably just a pass
Yeah.
through language to get there.
Yeah, just like run through like a byte stream. I know we talked about like maybe like even 2 years ago. There was like someone who had spun up like example of like GPT real time that like it's two agents talking to each other, and the moment that they realize they're both agents, like they can switch over to like a like a very like almost like old school like phone dialogue sounding thing. And apparently I'm fascinated that like you get emergent language somehow, or if that was Coda, or maybe it was just like Morse or something. I have no clue. But the idea that that can just be captured and just like instantly switched to is strange without it being like a sought out behavior. Let's
Yeah,
see.
so flipping to this, I'll kind of just read for the folks that are new. So like, this is Ethan Malik. I was kind of correct about that. I think he's the one that kind of discovered this. But in short, Fable starts to develop its own dialect to reinforce itself and many of its subagents. So, he kind of refers this to as a Claudish language becoming ever more Claudish. This is, again, both to the efficiency argument I was just making, I think, intuitive, but then also we have anecdotes of this because even if we can't perfectly define the text signatures of AI, people that are in this world do default to understanding when something was human generated or AI generated. They carry these very specific signatures. It used to be M dashes for a while. It was if it's
Right.
not this, it's that kind of things. Like there's just
Yeah.
these very kind of, you know, uh, reasonably difficult to explicitly define, but kind of very much you know it when you see it signatures of AI writing.
Right. Yeah. It's just I'm looking at like this sort of like novel communication thing. Like if again, if the current bet or the current like understanding is that most of the world is going to be running in token, if true token maxing ends up being like inference between machines effectively, it makes a lot of sense that like even just from a cost perspective, like the dialect of choice should be more efficient than what English is. Like there's this is a really strange analogy. Have you ever read Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell?
Yeah.
Like the example that they make about like rice patties? Um for the audience, and this might sound racist, but I swear it's not. Malcolm Gladwell wrote it. So first, the premise of the chapter is like why Asians are good at math, um, and without belaboring it too much, like it's an extension of like advantages compound, right? Like it's early choices about how to communicate and like understand and share information that compound into like sooner and sooner, you know, advantages. And so the example that's made is that in Asian cultures, when you're growing rice paddies, like the season of growing rice is so narrow, specifically, that to produce rice, you basically have to be like running like a very, very efficient clock. And what that did is that like Asian languages have very efficient syllables for numbers. So whereas like we say 22, right? That's three syllables. Like Asian languages like Mandarin, like Thai languages, Hindi languages, whatever it may be, because of the seasonality of growing rice, language from a very, very long time ago, their numbers are encoded to be communicated really, really quickly. What that means is that if you can efficiently communicate numbers, you can then proxy to like when you're 2 or 3 years old, you learn counting really fast. When you're 4 years old, you learn like math really quickly because your way of communicating interactions between numbers is also really, really fast. And so like it makes sense that you extend the analogy to like if you want these systems to be good at math, whatever it is, like their ability to communicate between one another should be like minimal syllable.
Mhm.
Like they should be able to encode as much information to one byte as humanly possible. And it's not helpful that English like we use like semicolons and long extended clauses and all sort of stuff. And the attention mechanism basically encodes the relationship between two tokens in a phrase. Why can't those tokens be tighter?
Mhm.
Like why do we have to jump across the whole KB cache to understand like, oh, this he or
Mhm.
this like pronoun is referring to this like entity that we referenced long ago. Can't we encode that entity in a somewhat smarter way that it makes sense that a recursive system would figure out? You know?
Yeah, it's also worth noting, I think, that this is another potential anecdote of a new form of intelligence that mirrors human intelligence. And what I mean by
Yeah,
that is like humans do this too with nicknames and acronyms,
yeah,
right? Like yeah, you it was an incredibly apt analogy there to the Malcolm Gladwell
mhm,
reference. Like I've actually long thought about this, but like one kind of funny anecdote from my own personal experience, but then just as the broader example. In English, we shorten mother to mom, we shorten father to dad. We do this all the time where we're constantly shortening common phrases and names such that we can communicate more efficiently and use
right,
less kind of bandwidth, cognitive load, if you will, to
right,
understanding things that we already can kind of preload. The quick anecdote, just for comment, is when my wife and I first got our dog, my only request in naming the dog was that the dog's name be one syllable because I was adamant that no matter what the dog's name was, we would just revert to a one syllable affection anyway. So we just
uh,
start there and then not have the runaround. And so I did end up winning that battle. Inevitably, we've also now introduced nicknames that are more than one syllable. So in some
nice.
ways, humans are still silly, but no matter what, I just think that the analogy is interesting. I think there's also some implications that are worth maybe riffing on at a different time too. If AIs invent their own language and they're no longer human traceable, what does that mean
Mhm.
for this kind of second and third order effects, which I think are interesting? But
Yeah, I mean, we're already at a point that like these models are black boxes to most people. Even within like the labs, there's some conversation about like we just keep giving the juice and trust that the recursion will kind of work, and it has. Like
mhm,
there. I think the number of people who are able to like map the model weights to what is happening deeper than what mixture of experts is very very low. Like I think that's a fairly um tiny skill set in the world, and there's a whole category of people who are focused on like interpretability, especially in the context of like safe action taking and alignment. But we'll see how much like again in the how much it's worth it for humans to actually understand that thing versus just like let the car run as fast as it can and keep letting it go faster. If it barrels out of our control but still safe, you know who
mhm,
knows.
yeah,
um But the models, I mean, they're to kind of like bookend maybe like we started on the tinfoil hat token maxing, but it's funny to kind of land on like the models are figuring out how to token min,
oh yeah,
on their own accord, which is not a thing most people I think would think about, even like independent of like the cultural or like corporate politics of like the money of this stuff is that these models are emerging on evolutionary behavior that has made certain societies survive better than others,
mhm.
which is fascinating. Um, but yeah, we're up there. Call it a day. We'll catch y'all next week and talk to y'all soon. Like, comment, subscribe. Peace.